small revenue stream that is controlled by one group that would basically inform how we support the platform or how we design the platform. And this non-profit nature of our work really makes us independent in this, that we do not sort of go into a certain political direction, that we are able to allow for neutral information, neutral points of view within Wikipedia articles, that we don't have to amplify certain articles for ads, for instance. We don't run ads, right? And don't have to monetize, how you say, eyeballs, right? Or clickbait. And so that basically, that non-profit nature really informs everything that we do. And there's a lot of other things that sort of are attached to this downstream, how the platform works, how the community works together, but I guess we can go into that later.
Sounds good. So other than the Wikimedia Foundation, which has headquarters in San Francisco, you have a pretty complex structure of chapters, affiliates, contributors, users of Wikimedia that also have a role in defining what kinds of contents are allowed in Wikimedia, and they have different functions within the content moderation scheme. Can you elaborate a little bit on what that is and what that looks like?
Yeah, happy to do so. And just a note, my name is Jake Rogers. I'm one of the legal directors at the Wikimedia Foundation. I've been there for about 6.5 years now, so I've had the opportunity to work with many of these different community members and chapters and different groups as well. And I think the chapter structure is really one of the reasons that we think of this as a movement and not just a company or a project, because there are people all around the world who are participating in actual knowledge creation, participating in raising awareness about the Wikimedia movement, in working with partners like local institutions, like libraries, archives, museums, to help share their knowledge and make it more freely available for people around the world. And so you see this kind of complex structure. From a corporate structure, the Wikimedia Foundation is the nonprofit that hosts the websites, and then each of the chapters is an affiliate entity, but not in the business sense. So they use the name, but they are completely independent entities that work within their local country to raise awareness, encourage people to edit, do partnerships with local institutions to share more content or other knowledge. And so they each kind of operate independently. And then there are less official groups. So there are things like user groups, which are not business entities. They're just groups of users like local clubs and that sort of thing that edit together. And then there are many, many people that just edit independently, joining the website as volunteers, working from home, students in their evenings, or people that have some free time and want to contribute. And they all just edit on the encyclopedia on whatever topic they might be knowledgeable about or can do research about, and contribute and constantly improve articles.
Sounds good. So when a user, let's go to a very practical question based on this. When a user has a problem with something that has been written on Wikimedia or any other of the services that you guys have, who do they approach? Who receives that complaint? What kind of complaint mechanisms do you guys have? So
the first thing to note is, in many cases, if a user encounters a problem in Wikipedia, they can just fix it. That's actually probably the vast majority of cases. Since Wikipedia articles are open and editable by anyone, the most common thing that happens is somebody's reading an article and they see a mistake, whether it's something simple like a comma is in the wrong place and they fix the grammar, or something where there's like a source missing, or there's just some important aspect of a topic that hasn't been covered or has been covered incorrectly. They can just go in and edit it and fix it themselves. And that's one of the ways that Wikipedia grows so effectively, is that people might look at a topic and realize they know something about it and decide to contribute. In cases where there is a dispute, there are a number of ways for people to work on that themselves. So if somebody makes a change and then someone else changes it back, every article has a talk page or discussion page, which allows users to just talk with each other about why they don't agree on how to edit the topic. And again, I would say of the vast majority of disagreements that come up, they are simply resolved by people talking with each other, understanding maybe why they don't see a source the same way, and getting that, they just come to an agreement with each other and resolve it. There is then, if you're now in the small handful of cases where people really are stuck in a disagreement, there are a few different things they can do. So you can have, there's an option to ask for comments from other editors, essentially trying to get a group consensus. Maybe 3 or 4 people can review the same source and reach a conclusion about whether it should be treated as reliably or whether there's something wrong with it. If someone is really engaging in bad faith, so they're not participating in the conversation, they're just undoing someone else's work, or they are participating in the conversation in an inappropriate way, there are users who are elected by the communities as administrators, and they kind of function as the moderators of the sites. And so there's a place to request an, excuse me. There's a notice board on the Wikipedias, one for each language, to request that an administrator review a matter, and they can potentially block a user. Usually it's minor, like they will block someone for a day or 2 to cool off. But of course, if someone is a frequent problem for some reason, they can be blocked for a longer time and eventually permanently. And that resolves almost all of the complaints that come up. In the very rare cases that doesn't resolve things, some of the biggest languages like English or French or German, I believe Spanish elected not to do this, have what's called an arbitration committee, which is a group of elected users. They actually run in kind of an open election in their language, and they have the ability to make a final decision on disputes between users. They take a very small number of cases. People sometimes talk about them as like the Wikipedia Supreme Court. They often do maybe like a case a month, so it's a very small number, but for very important disputes, they can rule on that. All of that is managed by the user volunteer communities. The Wikimedia Foundation as a company generally is not involved in these kinds of things, but we do act as a backstop. So if there is a situation where someone violates the law and that comes to our attention, we have the ability to act on that. And we outline in our terms of use the narrow range of behavior that is not acceptable on our projects, things like violating people's privacy or intellectual property, or stalking someone, or hacking our sites, or engaging in technological disruption. But we are kind of the last resort there. Generally, the communities are self-governing, and part of our goal as an organization is to help them to be self-governing and to give them that space to be self-governing. And only if there is something very serious, like a threat of harm or a legal violation, does the foundation as a company intervene.
Interesting. Kind of wondering, do you have, as a headquarters and sort of a last resort for this whole thing, do you have systems monitoring your networks permanently for illegal content or for things that violate your limited terms of services? Or do you rely on the specific local chapters to alert you that some of these things might or might not be happening?
So by and large, we're not monitoring. I think unlike some of the bigger corporate websites where they have a legal structure that says they're not obligated to monitor, but then they implement structures to monitor for a number of things, we are mostly not doing that. Most of our complaints come in with like just individual users or members of some of these like user groups will contact us and say that there's a problem, and then we'll investigate it. There is one exception to that, which is for child protection material. We use a hashing database based on the, I believe it's Interpol and the United States federal government what do you call it, like objects or files that are determined to be a violation of child protection and therefore can be found using a hashtag and that have been ruled on by a court. So there's a database of things that have been ruled on by a court as illegal child abuse in some way. And that we run a scan for with some frequency. I don't remember what the exact frequency is, but we scan for that occasionally. That particular area of content is kind of unique in that regard because it is both almost universally agreed on around all the countries in the world that that kind of content is illegal. And it is very easy to scan for in a way that other types of laws like intellectual property violations or defamation are very difficult to scan for. So that one was something we could do as a company at our scale, but that is the only thing that we do that kind of proactive monitoring for.
Agustina, if I may, I think there's also, of course, a policy and values-based additional answer to this, and that is that we don't want to do what has become known as upload filtering in the copyright context because of the various issues that arise in the context of freedom of expression around this, right? Context is very hard to detect for any of on any of these systems. Is it for documentation purposes? Is there actually somebody abusing these systems to stifle dissent? And there's a long tail of issues that arise when you implement automatic systems that remove content without a community like ours, right? Being able to weigh in on things, and that's the exact I don't want to say purpose of the community, but it's in the interest of the community and of shared knowledge and of decentralization of the knowledge creation to have those conversations on the talk pages that Jacob mentioned earlier. When something goes onto a Wikipedia article and it's disputed, maybe for its legality, maybe its veracity or other things, then people discuss this and after agreeing, remove it, right? Whereas when a system does this automatically, things don't even make it onto a platform, right? And that is in the context of dissent or actually like talking about political developments or say climate change, right? Even I think that can be a huge problem when knowledge is automatically suppressed.
Interesting. Do you guys, as headquarters, have the power to override community decisions on edits, on corrections, on people who have been sent to the freezer for a couple of days?
I actually think that's a complex question. I think we are the owners of the servers, so if we receive a legal demand that is, that we are subject to, that has jurisdiction over us, and that requires us to do something, then we have the technical capability to do that. I think though our relationship with the broader editor community is actually kind of a complex one. So even if we have the technical ability to make a change on the projects, we're not the only ones with that ability. There are many users that are kind of have escalated user rights of various sorts. They volunteer to work on our technical systems, for example. And so they also can make technical changes to the projects. And therefore, if we were to step in and change something and we couldn't offer a good justification as to why we were doing that, they have the power to undo some of those changes. And there's also a possibility that users would stop editing the projects or stop doing the work that they are currently doing if we engaged in behavior that they found really inappropriate. So even though we as a corporation have some capability to respond to things, if we start acting beyond what we have committed to in our policies and our terms and the relationship that we have with the communities, I think that we would be met with people who were very concerned and upset that we were acting that way and who would protest what we were doing.
I'm kind of wondering, you guys mentioned inappropriate content, harmful content a number of times now. And I'm kind of curious as to whether Wikimedia as a foundation has a common definition that of those that apply to their multiple services. Let me put the question differently. Do you guys provide a framework of not illegal content, but of legal content that you don't want to see within your platforms, and within which the different communities can act? Or are the different communities free to act within anything that's legal and that they consider per country, per region, per group appropriate, harmful or non-harmful? Or how do you manage that?
So I think there's a couple things I would say about this. First, I think we have this problem less frequently than some other websites do. I think when people think about the big social media websites like Facebook or Twitter, part of the reason they have so much trouble with harmful content is that they really are open to anything. And that's their design, where people can just talk about anything. Wikipedia is designed to be an encyclopedia. Wikimedia Commons is an image repository. Wikisource is designed to hold original primary source documents. And so that function of being like a limited purpose project actually cuts off a lot of the harmful content. Someone might try to post something that is, I don't know, like a pro-terrorist manifesto or something, and before it got met with a question of the harm, it would get met with the point that it's not appropriate to be on an encyclopedia. It's not what these sites are for. And so that actually prevents a lot of, I think, the most harmful types of content that people try to put on the internet. Beyond that, there are still, I think, encyclopedia topics that can be on, difficult topics or things that can be related to being harmful. There are some specific policies both developed by us and by the communities on this. So for example, there is a particular policy on the wikis that says you should not be posting how-to guides. So if somebody tried to post information scientifically about how to build a bomb, maybe that's something that an encyclopedia would host, but it's not something Wikipedia hosts because we don't do how-to guides. There are a few things in our terms of use that I think also go above kind of the legal minimum. So things like harassing people and violating people's privacy can violate our terms of use, even if they are not illegal. And we do investigate those kinds of claims and will sometimes help support our communities in dealing with someone who is a persistent harasser. I will also note on this front that we have been working on a universal code of conduct for the Wikimedia movement. That was just passed by our board of directors this past year, and there's currently a working group discussing what enforcement mechanisms there should be for the Universal Code of Conduct. That is designed as a document that will set kind of a minimum standard of behavior and collegiality amongst Wikimedia editors internationally. And so it will apply as kind of a minimum standard to all of the different projects to help people work together effectively. And I think we're very proud to be doing that. I think it will help our movement be more successful and people to be able to participate from many different backgrounds.
I was kind of wondering, I was reading about that whole process of the Universal Code of Conduct, and I was kind of wondering, what led you guys to do something like this? The Wikipedia project has somewhat of a long history, and you haven't had this kind of thing before. Was this community requested? Was this based on an overall evaluation of your many services that are community-based or community-led?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually, Agustina. And you're right. The Wikipedia, the English Wikipedia has, and others have just celebrated their 20th anniversary. So it's been a while since Wikimedia was established. But we have also, the movement has also engaged in a strategy process for the movement. And out of that process, one of the recommendations was to work towards more safety and inclusion in the community, and to make it basically a safe place to participate in knowledge. And out of that, this Universal Code of Conduct was deducted to really make the whole Wikimedia space a safer place for people to participate in, rather than just looking at individual projects, right? Because people move between projects, they may also participate in several projects at once. And so to make the whole place safer and more inclusive, the movement, but also the foundation, really realized that we need to support a more comprehensive framework for this.
Interesting. I'm receiving a couple of questions about the whole editor system and how that system works. So I'll pile them up sort of together, because I think they're all somewhat related. You have a community of editors. How does that community grow? Who decides how that community grows, and how new editors are appointed within a certain community? Very much related to this, how do you have a system to get complaints against editors if there's a number of people who disagree on how the editor is performing their works as editors? And then last but not least, and I think this one's particularly interesting, and it's something that I've been thinking about, especially because, well, I had the opportunity to discuss with you guys this issue before. There have been claims that that the Wikipedia community in some places may be politically inclined or socially inclined or ideologically inclined in one way or the other. And so the community of editors might not be as heterogeneous as we might want it to be. So do you guys, as headquarters for these different communities and for these different chapters, do you have means in place or alert systems as to how to keep those communities as vibrant, as diverse, as rich as possible, so that the editing of those sites does not become a majority of the Wikimedian users kind of point of view that's ruling the site? So 3 questions in one.
Those are all big questions. I'll try to go at them in the same order that you just asked them in. Your question was about who decides who is an editor, right? And I think everyone can. Like, if you decide to edit Wikipedia today, you're an editor, right? And you are part of the community and the movement. So basically, it's not up to the foundation. It's also not up to an affiliate or anyone really to decide whether somebody should be able to participate and contribute to an article or to several articles, or to input data into Wikidata, or upload a photo or image to Commons. And that is, I think, the secret sauce here, really. It's anybody can start editing anytime. And that leads to your second question. How do you measure performance? Well, we don't, right? I think performance might also be the wrong word. I think how collaborative or how productive is somebody is a better reframe, I think, if I may. And I would suggest to see this in the context of the policies that the communities have built together for how Wikipedia is grown, right? The rules that apply to what an article should look like, or how people should talk together or discuss an article, and people violating those rules may be sort of blocked, for instance, right? But it's more of a matter of, are you a productive member? Not really like about performance. It's not about like, have you edited 100,000 times, which is great. Don't get me wrong. We would love for people to be very prolific, right? But maybe you can't, right? And I think what's important is to be a productive member, to really work with others to expand knowledge on our projects. And the third point, I think, directly related to these, and Jacob may have more on this later, actually, directly related to these first questions, of course, is the fact, you're right, the community has been documented to be rather global north based, white, and then also, of course, male. And that is, I think, an expression or a result of the realities of what the internet looks like for a lot of people, what availability of time, devices, connectivity, and also interests look like, possibly. It's not something that we want to perpetuate. We are definitely working with the affiliates and with also partners and allies elsewhere, digital rights groups, also international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, etc., to increase the diversity of the community, to increase also the diversity and inclusivity of the content on Wikipedia. But again, due to the ways Wikipedia is built, it's not us recruiting members and saying of the community and saying, you should write this. But what we are doing is trying to empower people to feel safe, to join the movement in ways that they can, right? And so those three questions are actually really relevant, and they're directly linked. So when there is an internet shutdown in a certain country, people cannot edit from that place. And when that happens more frequently in one region, that region is not that well represented on Wikipedia. And then there are other policy issues if it is dangerous to edit from a certain place somewhere because a government may not want to see its work documented on Wikipedia, then people probably will feel like it's too risky to do that. And similar things arise around the world, from sort of like threats to life and limb to other maybe privacy concerns, or maybe even I just don't have the time, right? And there's a whole spectrum of things that we frankly globally need to address with the help of everybody on this call to make sure that the community can be more diverse.
Yeah, in addition to what Jan was saying there, which I think is all very correct, I want to make maybe one additional point. So there's one kind of thing, which is what Jan was talking about, which is the issue of like diversity and perspectives and making it safe for many different editors to participate. And I think that does address most problems with like biased perspectives or that sort of thing. Like bringing people in from different backgrounds is very effective. The other thing I would say, though, is that Wikimedia and Wikipedia are only as good as the overall knowledge ecosystem in the world. Wikipedia is structured to be an encyclopedia based on existing academic and other reliable sources like long-established news, magazines, etc. So if there is, like, for example, if in a particular language, almost all of the sources are biased in that language for various historical reasons on some topics, often the Wikipedia articles on those topics in that language will share that bias because those are the only reliable sources that are available. So all of you out there in academia doing research in different languages help make Wikipedia better as you cover different topics with different perspectives and provide new reliable research in journals around the world. When the ecosystem improves, Wikipedia's coverage and neutrality also improves along with it. And that's a really important part of the structure of the projects.
Thanks, guys. That was really clarifying. I was wondering, I have a few questions related to regulation and how this different approach to content moderation might enrich somehow the the discussions over content moderation regulation, which in my view are a lot of times pretty poor, sadly. Let me start by asking something that related to a topic that has been particularly controversial over the past 2 years, basically because of COVID. Disinformation, and how are you guys dealing with disinformation in Wikipedia entries? How are you guys training your editors on disinformation? Are you guys taking positive or proactive steps to engage the actively engaged people that you have within the community, right? So I don't mean the users necessarily, but the people who are editing the articles, the people who are correcting the articles, the people who are serving as, I have it written down somewhere here. What's the term you guys use? It's not supervisors. It's like administrators, right? You use the term administrators?
Yes.
So what kinds of measures are you taking to deal with this thing? And related to this question, are you seeing a more complex exercise in your content moderation of your sites with this phenomenon, or is it business as usual and this has not really taken a toll on the content or on the activity that you guys have vis-a-vis content moderation?
So I'll say some words about that, and I think Jan may also have some thoughts on how we are addressing disinformation as a topic. The first thing I will say is that I think that the existing processes of Wikipedia were already very resilient against disinformation efforts. Because you have this structure that says we want to write articles based on reliable sources, we want to use sources in the first place, we want good citation structures, all of that kind of exercise is really good at combating disinformation. And I think it's really good at combating disinformation in a relatively politically neutral way on top of that. People may have different views of the politics of a topic, but they can share the agreement about how we determine what a reliable source is from a policy that may have been discussed amongst users 10 years ago, and that can be updated through ongoing discussions. And so that level of discussion, like how do we determine what is a reliable source, is one where people can agree, even coming from many different backgrounds, and therefore contributes to high quality information and not disinformation in Wikipedia articles. I think on top of that, there have been sort of increased monitoring from the administrators on important topics. That has always been sort of a thing. I would say it used to be more for humor, like you would see people on an evening talk show make a joke, and then suddenly people would be paying very close attention to make sure the Wikipedia article wasn't distorted. Now it's more like a very notable politician may say something incorrect and people will pay very close attention to make sure the Wikipedia article is not distorted. But those kinds of structures from administrators are already in place. And there are certain systems, for example, if an article is the subject of frequent attempts at vandalism, administrators have a tool that can make it so you have to be like a more experienced editor. So like you can make an article so that it can only be edited by people who have, I think it's, you have to have had 10 edits and your account has to have existed for 4 days. And so people can't just keep making new accounts to try and distort an article. You have to have actually exist as an editor and do some other positive work before you work on that type of article. And that is often used on like articles of political or controversial topics to help ensure a little bit better quality. Maybe Jan, over to you for some of the foundation's efforts as well.
Yeah, I wanted to add, the way Wikipedia is also built means that there's no first-hand information, right, on there. You have to cite a source for something to be included, just like in a scientific paper in a way. Wikipedia is a giant peer review system, actually. And people have to point to their sources. So what what that means is that a conspiracy theory might make it onto Wikipedia, but people can still review where it comes from and do so, frankly. And that many editors actually focus on a list. English has one of, for instance, English Wikipedia has one, and I'm not sure about Spanish Wikipedia, to be honest, about sources that should be trusted and those that should not be trusted, right? Are there media outlets, news outlets that have a strong bias and tend to present facts in a way that basically supports those bias, that they may show up in that list, and then editors will not trust them and will not allow them to be included in Wikipedia. So that is actually a very strong mechanism to make sure that this information may make it onto Wikipedia, but then it's relatively quickly removed. On the foundation side, as we said earlier about monitoring, we don't have the capacity to generally monitor every article in every language that is created or edited at all times. We just don't. We're a small organization, 600 people only around the world, yes, with lots of knowledge about different languages, yes, but not with the capacity to review every article. And neither would we want to, given the system that we've just talked about, where the community really takes the lead and has agency over content of Wikipedia. On the policy side, you know me, Agustina, I usually go there. I think it's really important that we as a society, global society, ensure that that those sources, those great journalism keeps being accessible for people around the world. I think one major problem that we're seeing on social media platforms is that people share news outlets, share publications that are freely available, where people that don't go behind paywalls, where people have access, but that may go for clickbait, right? That may be based on a ad-only revenue model, where the most scandalous headlines, of course, travel the quickest and the farthest, and that is a real problem for people's access to truthful information. And then, of course, Wikipedia is closely linked to that. When people don't have access to those sources, they cannot bring those onto Wikipedia. They can only bring the bad ones. Hopefully they won't, but I think we really need to make sure that media also doesn't go into a direction where nobody has access to truthful information on the internet anymore.
Cool. I'm taking a very positive note. One of the things that I've been sort of thinking about as I've thought about disinformation is a broader crisis, other than a technological crisis, but a crisis of the most formal institutions that used to spread knowledge. So the fact that you guys perceive from the exercise in Wikimedia services that people seem to agree on what are reliable sources of information brings me a lot of optimism. I would love to do some research with that, and maybe we can discuss that later and see how we can put that in action. But it's really interesting that you guys are seeing that, as a lot of people are questioning precisely what is the concept of reliable information today, and how has that changed over the years, over the times. Pretty much related to this, we have a question from Ramiro Alvarez Huarte here from CELE, who's saying, has the ethos of the community changed in the last few years? And if so, how? It seems to me that one possibility is that people are these days more careful in how they treat one another, pronouns, trigger warnings, safe spaces, and so on. Did that happen on your services? And if so, how did the community adapt it to the new demands to change or create more rules?
So I can start on this one. I think the answer is both yes and no. So yes, the ethos did change on some important topics. I think the community has, for example, done a really great job on addressing LGBT plus rights of different users using appropriate names and pronouns and things of that sort. It's not perfect, as with any large internet community, but I think they've done a really good job with it. I think we've seen that on and in many similar topics, coverage of topics related to race and ethnicity, related to various different things of identity have often been covered quite well. And as the sources in those areas have changed over time, the article coverage has changed as well. And so have the collaboration between editors working in these spaces. At the same time, I think that the underlying ethos of our community has stayed the same, and that has kind of served people well. That is, there is this understanding that people are creating free knowledge to be open and available to everyone, to be reusable for any purpose, to be helpful for a general audience. That has not changed. There has not been an attempt to create knowledge only for a specific audience, or an attempt to create closed knowledge that can only be accessible by specific people. That is not something that would be in line with our community's values, and no one has tried to do that. So I think that the underlying ethos of the community has stayed the same in the free knowledge goal, but there are definitely specific things having to do with evolving understanding of people's identities and ability to collaborate and communicate with each other online that have evolved. And I think there are some areas where probably it needs to continue to evolve, and the UCOC is one of the spaces that will likely help with that by setting out some of those standards on those types of topics.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about what kind of time do we have? Not a lot. But let's talk a little bit about the legislative initiatives that we have seen coming out of different countries, the DSA proposal, the different rules or the different proposals that are coming from Brazil, from Mexico, from different countries that are very much concerned about how companies are or will be moderating content. What do you see as the main threats from those pieces of legislation to the model that Wikipedia has? What will be hard for you guys to comply with? What will be impossible for you guys to comply with? What do you see as positive measures good news within those laws or those initiatives? And please don't restrict your answer to the ones that I mentioned. If you can think of others that provide best practices, those are welcomed. But yeah.
Yeah, striking quite a nerve there, Agustina. Obviously, there are bills being presented, introduced, passed even around the world that I think, on the positive side, to start with that first, acknowledge that the internet is the main place where most of us talk these days. The pandemic has accelerated that. Democratic processes and how people share information, share opinions, access knowledge have moved online. And I think governments are acknowledging this and therefore are thinking about, okay, so how do we make those spaces better? How do we ensure that everybody can participate, that people can be safe, that our constituents are safe from harm, violence, disinformation, things that disrupt life and democracy. So I think that's the good news. The bad news is that they sort of go overboard on this, right? They have certain models in mind, the Facebooks and the Twitters or the YouTubes of the world, and don't understand that Wikipedia functions completely differently than those platforms, or that even other smaller platforms or forums, right? Somebody hosts a website where people just talk to each other in the comments in a way that is also platform functionality, right? But lawmakers often and governments don't often have that in mind. So that's sort of the bad news. And what we're seeing is that the trend is towards basically forcing platforms to remove content, be it hate speech or disinformation or otherwise unlawful content, quickly, maybe immediately, under basically threat of penalty if you don't comply within a certain time frame. Often that shrinks towards the 1 hour, even depending on what the content is. And that makes it very hard for a platform like Wikipedia to grow in the way that it has, right? As I mentioned earlier, automatic filtering seriously disrupts how Wikipedians can work together, right? If you think of a Facebook entry or a YouTube video just disappearing after you've uploaded it, that is bad, that can be bad, but it doesn't disrupt the whole platform. In the case of you contributing to an article and writing something in that article and trying to save it, and then it just goes away mid-sentence while somebody's also working on that article, that is incredibly disruptive, right? Just from a technical point of view. And of course, from a freedom of expression point of view, which is more your concern at CELE, and ours too, of course, this requirement to immediately remove content, even if it may come with good intentions from the lawmakers, really hurts the way that Wikipedia actually really successfully and effectively removes content already that might be illegal. Jacob had a really good explanation of how editors work together to remove things that violate the laws, the rules of this online encyclopedia that may even be stricter than the laws, right? So it's, in a way, it's absurd to think that terrorist content violates a encyclopedia policy, but it does. And that actually ensures that editors will remove it, right, before it even becomes a question of legality. And so that actually means it's much quicker. But it also ensures that we, as a foundation, don't make a call about what is legal and what is not, just under sort of a risk assessment for our legal risk, right? So what we're seeing around the world is really a need for us to educate lawmakers and governments. Hey, here's Wikipedia, here's how this works. And when you mandate removal within a certain time frame, that really interferes with our ability to empower the community and your constituents, right? We're talking about people around the world here, to build Wikipedia in a way that they have done so for 20 years. I think that's the main trend that I'm seeing.
Cool. Are you actively participating in legislative debates around this initiatives? Are you prioritizing any of them that might affect you or impact you more directly? I can imagine that legislative proposals in the US would probably have a rather larger impact on Wikimedia than other legislations, but just curious to.
Yeah, they do definitely. As a foundation based in the US, of course, we are affected by US legislation, but Section 230 is of course not the only legislative debate that we are participating in. The Digital Services Act in the EU is of big interest to us because it actively, or it can proactively shape I guess the next phase of internet legislation, and because lawmakers around the world, as you know, Agustina, often copy what the EU does, right? And for better or for worse. So if the DSA turns out to be to have a couple of really good examples in there of positive legislation, I think that is a great opportunity, right? So we approach the DSA not just from a defensive place, but we see a great opportunity there as well. We're also looking at, of course, what is happening in Latin America. In fact, we just signed on to a coalition statement calling for the withdrawal of a draft presidential decree in Brazil that might make content moderation in the way that Wikipedia does it much harder. And we're, of course, also looking at other places where Wikipedia is accessed and where our communities contribute to it, including Southeast Asia, Africa, and elsewhere.
One thing I want to add to that as well is there are also opportunities to influence the law after it has passed through like the judicial system and public debate and that sort of aspect. And one of the parts of our legal work as the legal team at the foundation is choosing to do that. So there are sometimes cases that come to us where maybe we could resolve the case in 5 minutes if we were just to comply with a court order and delete something. But we don't do that. Part of our legal strategy as an organization is to look at why we're being asked to change something. And even if it's a law that we don't necessarily think we're subject to the jurisdiction of, if we think that we can challenge that law in order to get a precedent that is advantageous for the free knowledge movement, or if we can clarify an ambiguous or vague law, we will often take that case on and use some of our resources as an organization to help defend the claim and get the courts to clarify and improve the law if it's like violating a constitution or something. And so that is part of our legal strategy. And even if a law might be facially neutral and acceptable in general, if we receive a particular demand that we think is violating someone's human rights, we will often try to defend that. And we actually have a program to defend individual users or help them to obtain legal representation if someone is unfairly harassing them for their good faith editing. Interesting.
I was looking at your transparency reports in preparing for this conversation, and a couple of things came like right out from the transparency reports. One is that you don't have as many requests for user information as other companies do. The other is you don't have as many legal requests as the other big companies, particularly, I mean big in the sense of the amount of content that you guys deal with, right? And the amount of users that you guys have within the platforms, and the difference between comparable platforms and you guys is astonishing, really. Why do you think that is?
I think the easy answer is to say it's because a lot of what Wikipedia does works really well. I'll say particularly on the content request side, I think that the processes to review articles, the work that people do collaboratively to make sure that articles are good quality and well written, as well as the free culture commitment. Like, I think one of the reasons that the number of DMCAs we have is so low is that we have very few copyright problems in the first place, because the commitment of Wikipedia is that the images and the media are freely reusable by anyone for any purpose. And that free culture standard is actually so much higher than the minimums of copyright law that almost everything on there is like not an issue. And there's just that tiny handful of, someone uploads a photograph claiming that they own it when they actually don't, and it slips through the cracks, but there's just a really small number of those. And that's why the number of requests that we receive to the legal department is so small. I think that's probably true of user data as well. That is, we just don't collect very much in the first place. And a lot of it is like public anyway. You can see all the edits that someone is doing. You can see an article history page. You can understand how it was changed. And so people are only asking us for data in that way if they really want to like unmask and sue a specific editor, which doesn't happen very often because mostly someone that is that disruptive and deserves to be sued will be blocked from editing long before it gets that far. So it's just like, I think the structure of the projects and the work that the volunteers are doing is heading off 99% or more of these types of problems. And only what is coming to the foundation in our transparency report are these like little things that slip through the cracks.
Cool. I was thinking about, I was trying to link both answers with Jan's previous answer about the legislative requests that are coming, and the requests for automation, content monitoring, and whatnot. So if I'm understanding this correctly, would it be accurate to say that most of the issues that other companies have, or at least that are showing through their transparency reports, and that legislators are concerned about, might be solvable through this kind of community model, but not within the frameworks that the legislation is looking for? Within the time frames, not the frameworks.
Wait, so just to make sure that I understand the question, this is still about the number that we receive of requests?
Yeah, I mean, the number of requests are really low, and the number of requests to remove content is also really low. It talks about some level of efficiency of the community moderated content. If you compare those with the numbers that big companies have, which are the causes for concern, basically, that are raising this legislative initiatives.
Okay, yeah.
I'm kind of wondering, where do you see the differences? To me, in my mind, and based on what I know of the different companies, timing is definitely an issue. How soon do you want the content to be taken down? How soon do you want the whatever piece of content not be available anymore? Wondering if you identify others.
Yeah, I think there's something that we haven't talked about until now on this call, and that's the architecture, right? The functionalities of Wikipedia. So what we don't have is a shared button, right? Or retweet, or send to all of your contacts, or like. And so basically no amplification of any sorts, right? Of course, you can take a Wikipedia link and send it via WhatsApp, or you can send it, or you can take a screenshot and send it somewhere, or post it on Facebook. But Wikipedia itself does not amplify things in that way. And we also don't have algorithmic amplification, where people sort of like are served more and more dark, potentially auto-played videos that send them down in some sort of rabbit hole, right? There is a rabbit hole on Wikipedia, don't get me wrong, people read and read and read. But it's not this sort of really like eyeball capturing sort of echo chamber that other platforms have built in, for the reasons that are linked to your very first question, right? Which are for-profit motives, right? And our architecture does not do that. And I think that is one factor that actually has also ensured that Wikipedia is actually not the most interesting place to go and harass somebody, or to spread hate speech, or to really share some sort of conspiracy theory because you don't reach your uncle there, right? And your friends and family are probably not on Wikipedia in a way they are in a group on Facebook. So the motives and the reasons why people are on Wikipedia are very different often. And I think that's something that really is important to acknowledge as well and to point out.
I think you've just given me the right kick for the last question. Wikipedia has been used by Google to link to their knowledge panels. Is that I understand you don't have a scheme of dissemination through social media buttons, and you cannot connect in that way, but you do have a pretty loud speaker when your content is taken, is the primary source for Google's what are they called? Knowledge panels.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a case in Argentina, which is pretty interesting. Two cases, actually. One of the current vice president, former president, and one of the current first lady, where their Wikipedia entries were attacked. I don't know the technical word for that. And they are planning on suing Google basically because of it is their Google knowledge panel that is disseminating that information. So a quick question for you: do you have a formal agreement with Google for them to drive that information or to be their primary source of information?
No, we actually don't right now. The way that Google does this is they're simply using information from Wikipedia under the same license that it is available to everyone else in the world. It is under a Creative Commons CC by SA 3.0 license, which means anyone can reuse it for any purpose, including commercially, as long as they give attribution and keep their derivative works under a compatible license. And so they've been doing this for a long time without really asking us. It's not something we want to prohibit, but it's not something where we made a formal agreement with them to do this. They just felt this was good information and they wanted to provide it. There is, I'll kind of use this moment to mention Wikimedia Enterprise, which you may have seen in a couple of news sources. So that is an attempt by the foundation to provide large commercial entities like Google with a way to kind of get our data in a high quality way. We're not selling Wikipedia, we're just selling them the ability to make high speed, large volume requests and get that data in a good way that is effective. And we're hoping that what that will do is give them a way to essentially contribute to the projects by purchasing this better way of getting the data and help sustain the free knowledge movement in that way, instead of just using it and benefiting from it, but not really giving back to support the movement. And we're hopeful that a number of companies will use Wikimedia Enterprise, and maybe also people, researchers or others who find something where they want to get a lot of data very useful. But that's a new venture, and I'm actually not sure if it'll be successful or not. Up to the present moment, it has just been that it is all freely available, and companies like Google build their own tools to get it at volume. And we hope that it is used well. As you mentioned, there have been some examples where maybe they displayed a quote from Wikipedia out of context that was misleading, or where a particular search result was showing something that wasn't really accurate for that search. That is actually kind of not our problem. I think there's something in the fundamental design of search that is it will always show you a result for your search. And so what often happens is someone searches something very specific and there isn't actually a good result for that question. And so Google will pull a Wikipedia article that shares one or two terms with it, and that can result in accurate information being presented in a misleading or out of context way. And that is because when you do a search, the search engine tries extremely hard to give you some result, even if there is no good quality answer to the question that you posed.
Great. Well, guys, we are right on time. I want to thank you a lot, both of you, for your time, for your willingness to talk to us and to respond to all the questions that we posted. I think I covered all the questions that were posted to the chat. Definitely looking forward to continue the conversation in another time. Always curious to hear how this beautiful project is developed. And I want to thank everybody else for joining. We're in the middle of our CELE workshop number 9. So we're discussing all these issues of content moderation and regulation of platforms and surveillance and monitoring and whatnot. This has been really helpful. I want to thank you a lot again.
No, thank you for the invitation, and thanks for all the questions also. Glad to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting us. This was a great chance to talk about all the stuff we're doing.
Thanks again. And for the workshop people, we're seeing each other in an hour. So I'll see you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye-bye.